So today is actually a very special day for me. In our lives, we all have these dates that we can't forget. Today is one of those for me, because today is my youngest daughter's birthday. And she's going to share a birthday with Benji and Anna Van Fleet's new one who just arrived today as well. Yeah, it seems like yesterday for me, though it's today for them, that we were driving to the hospital, waiting to see what this baby would be like. What would she look like? What would it be like to hold her? And watching her grow from this tiny blob of flesh into a unique human being is one of the great joys and exhaustions of my existence. But one of the greatest parts about raising kids is watching them imagine. My girls love to play pretend. They play pretend gymnastics, pretend school. They love to give each other imaginary names. Emily, Hannah, I don't know, they have different ones every week. And they'll say, pretend you're the coach, and you say, okay, Hannah, it's time to do your floor routine, or okay, class, it's story time. They love to play pretend. And they do it from the things that they see and know. We don't have a lot of pretend astronauts or aliens at our house because we don't read a lot of space books. They draw their imaginations from the things that they have experienced. It's the same with the careers that they imagine. I say, what do you want to be when you grow up? And they say things like teachers or doctors or dentists or gymnastics coaches, and sometimes a couple of them, they'll say preacher every now and then. But that's how imagination tends to work, right? That we draw on our experiences to build the things that we've never encountered or seen before. In an article about imagination as knowledge, Dr. Murray Hunter wrote, quote, "Imagination is a manifestation of our memory. It enables us to scrutinize our past and construct hypothetical future scenarios that do not yet, but could, exist. Memories of our experiences fuel our imagination. We take these pieces of things that we know, we deconstruct them, and then reconfigure it in order that we might have an imagination." The way we think about heaven is probably a lot like this. We've heard the biblical passages and the hymns about heaven, streets of gold, pearly gates, crowns, and all of that. And so we take images of things that we know and deconstruct them and form them again into something that we could imagine, a future scenario of something we've never experienced before. When it comes to imaginations of our faith, as Dr. Ellis preached about a few weeks ago, our greatest imagination of faith is for the redemption and reconciliation of all creation. But what memories or building blocks or experiences do we use to fuel that imagination of reconciliation? What do we draw upon in order that we might deconstruct it and then reconfigure it into this ultimate glory? Well, some of the pieces that Paul uses to construct an imagination of ultimate redemption are in the passage we just heard Ethan read from Romans 8. Paul writes to the church in Rome having never met them, but knowing they face some difficulties in their existence as a community of believers. Paul's writing from his Jewish background, but he's not writing to only Jews, but to non-Jews. He writes about righteousness, faith, and the law, but Paul also writes about imagination. When Paul begins in verse 18, he acknowledges that the people are enduring some sort of present suffering, but says those sufferings are not worth comparing to the glory that will be revealed in them. So in order to create an imagination of glory, the immediate memory or experience that Paul draws upon is the experience of suffering. Now, Paul doesn't specify if this is some sort of specific collective event that they have undergone, or if it's just a matter of the suffering that each individual has gone through. But Paul knows that surely everyone who hears or reads this letter will have some sort of experience of suffering to draw upon. So Paul takes that shared experience and deconstructs it to fund an imagination of the opposite. He uses suffering to imagine glory. It's what Walter Brueggemann would call a counter-imagination. Brueggemann says the work of the church is not to construct a full alternative view of the world that we live in, but to fund or provide the pieces and resources out of which a counter-imagination of the world might be created. So Paul funds this counter-imagination of something wonderful by contrasting it with something not wonderful. He says suffering will be surpassed by glory. And some may say that in this, Paul is discounting the suffering by saying, oh, it will be surpassed. But I beg to differ, because I think that Paul is actually validating that pain, that great pain, by acknowledging it and using it to project the opposite. If Paul was saying, hey, your suffering's not really all that bad, then he would be saying, glory is not really all that good. So Paul uses suffering to fund an imagination of redemption. Another piece that Paul seems to use as a building block is the image or experience of slavery. Paul says there's hope for creation to be liberated from its bondage to the decay that it has been subjected to and be brought into freedom and glory. Bondage and freedom, subjugation and liberation, these are the language of slavery. For his Jewish audience, Paul may be drawing on the collective memory of the Jewish people in their Egyptian slavery and that crucial event of the Exodus, when God gave the Israelites freedom and liberation. Glory, reconciliation, redemption will look a lot like that memory of being released from Egyptian slavery. Having shackles released, discovering humanity in newfound freedom. But for his non-Jewish audience, the vocabulary of slavery and release was also common. Slavery was prevalent in the Roman world. Surely every person had firsthand experiences of seeing what slavery looked like. They could know what kind of a life-changing experience it would be for a slave to find freedom. So suffering and slavery were common images that Paul was using to build this imagination. But Paul also draws on another memory or experience. Paul says in verse 19 that creation waits in eager expectation for the children of God to be revealed. This is what all of creation is waiting on. Later in the passage, Paul even describes creation as not only waiting, but anguishing as if in the pains of childbirth. Groaning inwardly with the Spirit are what we do as we await redemption. The correlation of all of this being that the eager and anguished waiting for redemption, for the fullness of an imagination of glory, will come when the children of God are revealed. So how might we interpret this crucial revelation of the children of God in terms of our imagination coming to fruition? In Paul's Greek, the children of God are the tonwion tu theou, literally the sons, plural, of God. Though often sons can refer to more than just males, thus the translation children. Now, as we're trying to understand this, if rather than saying creation was waiting the revelation of the sons, plural, of God, Paul had said creation was waiting the revelation of the Son, singular, of God, we can know exactly what Paul meant there. It was Christ. That's what all creation is waiting on, for Christ to be revealed again. But that's not what Paul says. So in thinking about the identity of these sons of God, we could go to the Old Testament notion of the kings of Israel and Judah being called the B'nai Elohim, the sons of God. as they're referred to in the Davidic covenant and in the enthronement psalms like Psalm 2. After all, in the Old Testament, the kings of Israel and Judah were charged with bringing justice and reconciliation to their kingdoms. They were in charge of caring for the poor and the widows. They were in charge of making sure their kingdom was a just place to live, though they never really succeeded in that. Or for Paul's non-Jewish audience, the phrase Son of God would also be a common image, because the Son of God was the emperor. Roman emperors were thought to be offspring of the divine. They were worshiped as gods. They were literally called the Son of God. Propaganda about the emperor would tell of how benevolent the emperor would be to all of his subjects, all the things the emperor made possible for the Roman people by conquering enemies and building magnificent palaces, cities. The emperor, the Son of God, brings about the Pax Romana in which Rome supposedly lived in peace. And when the emperor is revealed or comes to patron a town or comes marching in a parade after squashing a rebellion or conquering a territory, the emperor was thought to bring with him happiness and glory and this extravagant party that followed him wherever he went. When the emperor comes to your town, the Son of God is revealed. He brings glory, which is very similar to what Paul said. But to the common Roman people, those who were forced to pay exorbitant taxes in order to fund the empire and those palaces, those who were forced to give their land over to the soldiers when they came marching through their territory, those who suffered in the diseased and unclean, overly populated slums of the lowest of the low in towns scattered throughout the empire, to them the emperor, the supposed Son of God, brought anything but glory. The emperor brought pain and suffering. So while the function of the kings of Israel and Judah and the emperor were supposed to be for justice, for glory, for redemption, I don't think that Paul is saying that those king-emperor type people are the ones who are going to bring this eagerly awaited reconciliation of all of creation. No, like glory is the opposite of suffering, and liberation is the opposite of bondage. I think that Paul is saying that the children of God are the opposite of the king-emperor, the son, singular, of God. While the king-emperor is the one person on top of the hierarchical pyramid of humanity, being the children of God implies the elimination of that hierarchy. The emperor or king, the Son of God, operates to supposedly bring justice through hierarchy, through power and control. But being revealed as the children of God is to embrace humanity's identity as sharing the same divine origin. All humanity are equal as brothers and sisters with God as our parent. And like any child, all God's children are made out of pieces of their parent. All God's children are made in the image of God. Tomorrow, nearly 200 people will gather in this place for the Women in Ministry Conference, which has the theme of reflecting God's image. Though yesterday some of us received ashes, and we remembered that we are dust, and to dust we will return, today and tomorrow will also be reminded that we may be dust. But we're not only that. Our dust is woven together with threads of the divine. And I think that when Paul says creation eagerly awaits for the children of God to be revealed, he may be trying to show us what would happen when those threads of the divine are unraveled from the pieces of dust to reveal all of humanity's shared identity as the children of God. Because understanding our identity as children of God, being made in the image of our divine parent, is fundamentally about the reconciliation of all humanity. After all people, not just kings or emperors, not just men, not just priests, all people are made in the image of God according to Genesis 1:28. And when we're able to grasp that oneness we share in our divine composition, then all hierarchy and power and domination and supposed benevolence, all of that is removed. Terence Fretheim writes about having a divine parent, and he says this: when all human beings are created in the image of God, common notions of kingly divine power are subverted. Whatever its royal connections, the image of God entails a democratization of human beings. All human hierarchies are set aside. When humanity is revealed as being in the image of God, no person values their own existence or needs or wants more than anyone else's, thus making possible the path to the reconciliation of people. All of Paul's imagery in this passage from Romans 8 is about this very thing. It's about being made in the image of God. As children of God, we suffer just like God suffers. Just like Christ, the incarnation of God's image, suffered. But our participation in that divine suffering will be surpassed by God's glory. As children of God, we can be freed from our bondage. Discovering our identity as God's image liberates us from slavery to earthly strivings. As children of God, when we acknowledge the divine composition of humanity, we make ready the path to the reconciliation of all people being treated equally, to removing the hierarchy that creates oppression, abuse, violence, and subjugation in the world. The end of sufferings, the freedom from our strivings, people being treated equally, that's an imagination of glory and redemption that I can eagerly await. But I have to admit that my experience with those things is limited. I don't have clear images or memories of what an end to suffering and all people being treated equally looks like. My finite humanity has not revealed that to me. But I can still imagine a construction of a future scenario that does not yet, but could exist. Paul says creation is anguishing as if in the pains of childbirth, waiting for this. And like creation, we too wait for this redemption with the Spirit. We're groaning inwardly as we wait for the revelation of the children of God. And on this day, just a few years ago, I too was anguishing in the pains of childbirth as I waited for a child of Meredith, a child of James, to be revealed. I too groaned inwardly and maybe a little outwardly while I eagerly awaited her. And as I did, I tried to imagine what she would be like. And my memories and experiences funded those imaginations. Would she look like my older daughter? Or would she look like the pictures that we have of James and I when we were babies? I wondered what she would be like when she grew up. Would she be stubborn and tenacious like her father? Gregarious or shy? What would she love to do or be? I couldn't help but imagine myself in her. And though my imaginations were funded by my own experiences for sure, they actually were counter imaginations. Because my imaginations for her would be the best versions of myself. She would win that U.S. Open that I never could. She would star in a Broadway musical. She would finish her PhD in those idealized 4 years. And so as I imagined what she would be like in waiting for her, I imagined the best possible version of me coming to fruition in her life. At the end of the day, our imaginations of reconciliation and redemption are limited. Like my kids who never dream of being astronauts because they don't have the necessary building blocks to fund that imaginations, we cannot even fathom what the redemption of all creation will actually be like. Because our imaginations, as amazing as they may be, are restricted by our humanity. However, the imagination of our divine parent is boundless. The God in whose image we are made imagines the best possible version of God's own self coming to fruition in the lives of the children of God. So while we can take the pieces that Paul gives us to create an imagination of redemption and tie them together with our own memories and experiences, our imaginations can never compare to that of our divine parent. And though God's imagination is something we can never see or know, as Paul says, hope that is seen is no hope at all. So let us fund our imaginations of ultimate reconciliation through our identities as God's children. But also, let us, the children of God, made in God's own image, place our hope in the imagination of our divine parent, who is able to do immeasurably more than we can ever ask or imagine. Amen.